Much as the Luftwaffe had accidentally bombed the residential districts of London only 2 years before, the small town of Vigny had not been the intended target of that evening's air raid. The British bombers had instead been making their way towards Paris, with orders to destroy the Renault factory located within the city's western suburbs. This mission would be remembered as a great success, the largest Allied bombing raid of the war so far. Just shy of 250 RAF aircraft would deposit 500 tons of ordnance directly onto the construction works, permanently depriving the occupation forces of a vital supply of lorries and other machinery components. Unfortunately for the residents of Vigny, a small group of the Allied bombers had become separated from the main contingent. Flying blind, unable to vector in on their target, they were surprised by a pair of patrolling Luftwaffe night fighters. As panic spread throughout the air crews, the decision was made to jettison their payloads before turning and heading for home. Whilst the town's inhabitants slept in their beds, death rained down from the night skies above. Several houses were completely obliterated, not one family member escaping the destruction. And in the fields around the location, whole herds of animals were killed or maimed, a few escaping through gaps in the broken fences, fleeing into the surrounding countryside. As the survivors sifted through the smoking debris the following morning, they discovered the body of the local priest. Father Camus lay half buried under a pile of brickwork, the twisted remains of his bicycle a short distance away. With heavy hearts, some local labourers retrieved his broken remains before taking him back to lie at rest in the rectory on the outskirts of the town. In the aftermath of the tragedy, as the residents struggled to regain some sense of normality, stories of puzzling incidents began to circulate. In the farms and outlying buildings around Vigny, animals had begun to go missing. At first, these consisted of cats and dogs, but then larger creatures such as mules and pigs disappeared, escalating to a whole cow in one instance. The gendarmerie recorded the reports from the town's inhabitants, offering words of sympathy, whilst pointing out there was little they could do. There was a war on, after all. In the few cases where officers attended the scenes of these disappearances, they found no obvious sign of human involvement, or the tracks usually associated with predators or vermin. Amidst this ongoing peculiarity, the town's new padre arrived. Yves Masson was much younger than Father Camus had been, idealistic and eager to make a positive impression on his new flock. He began to divide his time between clearing out the belongings of his predecessor from his residence, whilst going from door to door to introduce himself to the townsfolk. It was with the discovery of the bodies of 2 local poachers that the urgency of the ongoing situation was finally recognised. Both men had been universally disliked by the people of Vigny, common drunks with a propensity for causing little but misery, but the manner of their deaths was shocking to the residents. Broken and battered, their corpses torn open and organs missing, it was generally agreed that no person of sound mind would have perpetrated such a hideous crime. The police conducted interviews with those residing in the immediate area of the crime scene, garnering little of value. The men's camp was located hidden in woodland, a short distance away, undisturbed, and showing no signs of a struggle having taken place. Inevitably, rumours circulated that German troops had executed the poachers after a protracted period of torture, suspecting them of aiding the resistance. With each passing week, further deaths or disappearances followed. A farmer who had gone out to investigate a sound in the dead of night failed to return to his young wife. Children, playing on the banks of a river, found a pile of fishing equipment with no sign of the owner. A number of wild boar were discovered, torn to pieces and carelessly discarded around a forest clearing. In desperation, the local police commander asked Father Masson to accompany him to the German military authorities to seek assistance with their problem. Their commander, a major by the name of Kraus, responded to the request with a mixture of mockery and indignation. The problems of local law enforcement, he decreed, were of little interest to the Wehrmacht. Only days after this blunt refusal of assistance, the residents of Vigny were woken by the sound of angry yelling and doors being kicked open. They emerged from their houses, bleary-eyed and in a state of confusion, to find a detachment of German soldiers herding 10 of their young men into the town square. Awaiting them there was Major Kraus, his face a picture of fury. The bodies of 2 of his men had been found, hideously dismembered, in fields not far from the town. It was not known what the pair had been doing away from their barracks, or who had attacked them, but if the perpetrators did not identify themselves immediately, then the youths now being taken into custody would be executed. Ignoring desperate pleas for clemency from the mothers of the teens, Kraus waited a further 10 minutes before ordering his men to shoot the detainees. The bloody task completed, he again addressed the townsfolk, promising that any additional act against his men would result in a further 20 deaths. The German soldiers then left, leaving grief and misery in their wake. During the week that followed, the young priest helped his traumatized flock come to terms with their losses, burying the dead and offering comfort to their families. Then one morning, German soldiers returned, asking for him and the police commander to accompany them to their barracks. It was with some trepidation the two Frenchmen agreed, bracing themselves for further threats and intimidation from Major Kraus. They were instead greeted by a different officer, who introduced himself as a Captain Haas and explained that he was the Major's replacement. Offering his visitors a drink, the captain explained in blunt terms that his predecessor was dead, and the fate of the people of Vigny now lay entirely in the hands of their community leaders. Someone had killed the Major, no doubt in reprisal for his heavy-handed methods of keeping authority, and that person needed to be brought to justice. It was related that Kraus had been travelling back to the barracks on the previous evening from a social function, and had ordered his driver to pull over so he could relieve himself in some nearby bushes. The orderly had duly complied, only to subsequently hear panicked cries emanating from the undergrowth nearby. Grabbing his sidearm, he had charged into the tree line and witnessed the Major being dragged further into the foliage by a dark and imposing figure. The adjutant had raised his weapon to fire, only to freeze when the attacker had screeched at him, issuing forth a piercing and inhuman cry. Moments later, he was back in the staff car and driving back to the barracks at speed in search of assistance. A squad of infantrymen had immediately returned to the scene, finding only the blood-soaked and tattered remains of the Major's uniform. Having concluded his story, Haas politely informed his guests that he could afford them 1 week in which to identify and apprehend those responsible for his commanding officer's murder. He highlighted to the Frenchman he had no desire to cause additional bloodshed than that already inflicted upon the town, but equally, his superiors would not allow him to leave the matter without taking action. The captain then rose to his feet and motioned for another officer to approach who had been seated nearby. In matter-of-fact terms, he explained that Lieutenant Engel had a background in law and would be accompanying the Frenchmen for the duration of their task. The lieutenant would facilitate any military assistance that the police might need and report back with any concerns he had about the thoroughness of the investigation. A short time after this, the trio then found themselves travelling back to Vigny in an uneasy silence. Bertram Engel was roughly the same age as Father Masson, and the polar opposite of other German soldiers that the Frenchman had encountered. Nervous and quietly spoken, he explained that prior to the war he had been qualified as a criminal prosecutor, only to be bullied into a career in the military by an overbearing father. Ill-suited to the role, Engel had been quietly moved around a number of units, before finally being sidelined in occupational France. When informed of this temporary assignment by Haas, the young lieutenant had initially protested that he had neither the skills or experience for such a task, before realising that his objections were falling upon deaf ears. Desperate to avoid further deaths, the police commander and his men moved from house to house, demanding the residents identify the killer in their midst. Separate to this, Masson and Engel made their own inquiries, adopting a more gentle approach. By the end of the day, it was clear that nobody had information to offer them, despite the impending threat of further German retaliation. That evening, with darkness having fallen, Masson invited Engel to dine with him at the rectory. Despite the circumstances in which they had been thrown together, the two men realised they had much in common. Over a hearty meal, they spoke freely about their hopes for the future, both confident that neither would use such conversation against them at a future point. This dialogue was suddenly interrupted, though, by an unexpected knock at the door. Masson found a young girl waiting outside, who explained she lived on one of the farms on the outskirts of Vigny. Prior to his death, Father Camus had entered into an arrangement with her parents, whereby she delivered a live calf to the rectory at the beginning of each week. Her father had now sent her to inquire if this was an arrangement that Father Masson wanted to continue. Having politely declined the offer and allowed the disappointed youth on her way, Masson returned to the dining table, a distracted look now on his face. When the German inquired what the issue was, the priest replied that as far as he had been able to tell, Bernard Camus had been a vegetarian, with absolutely no interest in the keeping of livestock. Unable to shake the feeling that this revelation was somehow important, Masson excused himself and went off to find his predecessor's financial records. Returning to the dining table, he then went through them, searching for evidence of the alleged transactions. As the girl had stated, there was indeed a payment at the start of each week, though its true nature had been hidden by the old priest. Each subtraction had been recorded under a false heading, such as groceries or building materials required for the general maintenance of the church. Both men agreed that there must be some significance to this deception and began to search through the building. A few minutes later, Engel uncovered a leather-bound journal, which had been secreted behind wooden panelling in the study. As he leafed through the handwritten pages, his face grew pale, before he handed the open book to Masson. Staring up at the priest from the page that Engel had paused on was a creature straight from Satan's kingdom. Crudely rendered in pencil, the drawing was of a towering behemoth, possessing curved talons and a mouth packed full of misshapen teeth. 2 great wings opened out from behind it, giving the appearance of some form of prehistoric monster, with dark gaping voids where its eyes should have been. Turning the page, Masson began to read the words that were written there with rising disbelief. Back when Father Camus had taken over the parish, the outgoing priest had entrusted him with a terrible secret. Not far from the town, tunneled deep into a solid rock face, was a cave. It was alleged that this tunnel extended down to hell itself, and was used by a demon to access the living world. Unable to defeat the creature in battle, a deputation of local knights had pleaded with their holy man to come to an arrangement with their opponent. A bargain was struck, whereby a living animal would be sacrificed to the entity each week to spare the townsfolk. Since that time, generations of priests had fulfilled this unholy bargain in order to protect their people. Since he had arrived in the parish, Camus recorded that he had been feeding the monster livestock on a weekly basis in order to safeguard his community. In his observations of the creature, he had noted that it didn't seem to age or succumb to illness, and that he was unsure if it was demonic or perhaps something more inexplicable. Masson's gaze rose to meet that of the German officer, neither wanting to admit that they believed the haunting text they had just pored over. And yet, both found themselves unable to offer any alternative explanation for the events that were now unfolding around them. In preparation for the day he would hand his responsibility on to another, Father Camus had drawn a map disclosing the location of the cave. Eager to prevent further deaths, the 2 men hurried to the nearest farm, where the presence of a uniformed German officer proved sufficient to persuade the nervous proprietor to offer up one of his animals in the dead of night. A half-hour trek deep into the surrounding woods later, the pair finally arrived at their destination. Set deep into a towering wall of rock was a dark portal, which seemed to stretch down into endless darkness. Driven into the ground immediately in front of this entrance was a metal ring, which the journal instructed that the sacrificial animal be tethered to. Hands shaking from nervousness, it took Masson several attempts to secure the lamb which he had obtained to the metal ring, whilst his companion watched on from the nearby tree line. His task complete, the priest then withdrew to join Engel, and the 2 men waited to see if there was any truth in the journal's tale. They did not have long until they found out. Initially, the only sound was the pitiful bleating of the animal secured outside the cave entrance. These cries suddenly increased in intensity as a large figure stepped forward from the shadows. It walked with purpose up to where the farm animal was struggling to free itself, but then stopped, turning instead to regard the 2 men standing a short distance away. In the light of the full moon that hung low overhead, Masson could see fresh gore staining the creature's mouth. Its chest rose and fell heavily as it surveyed them, long taloned fingers opening and closing reflexively on its large hands. The lamb was shrieking now, straining against its leash to escape the monster, which instead focused entirely on the nearby humans. Masson stepped forwards, crucifix raised. He spoke purposefully, explaining that Camus was dead, and that he was the new priest. He had no idea if the creature understood his words, but he continued regardless, insisting that no other person needed to die. The monster did not reply, continuing to regard him intently from the two gaping voids where its eyes should have been. The padre came to a halt a few feet away, still brandishing his crucifix, promising to uphold the arrangement that his predecessors had made with the beast. With a piercing and sudden cry, the monster lashed out, knocking Masson to the floor. One of its claws caught the right side of the clergyman's face as he fell, leaving a deep and bloodied wound in the skin as it did so. In a heartbeat, it was atop him, mouth wide open to reveal its wicked teeth. As it reached down, Masson closed his eyes, expecting nothing but death. Then there was gunfire as the lieutenant opened up on the attacker with his sidearm. The pistol's bullets ripped into the creature's torso, but it barely seemed to register them, instead rising slowly to its feet. Engel continued to fire in desperation, right up until the point where the arm that held his weapon was brutally severed from his body. Moments later, his throat was torn open, and the creature fell upon him to feast. Masson fled, tears and blood streaming down his face. He ran as fast as his legs would allow him, back to the main road, and then straight to the German garrison. Barely able to speak, the priest collapsed at the main gates, leaving the bewildered sentries on duty there to decide what to do with him. Regaining consciousness an hour later, he found himself lying on a cot in the infirmary. Haas was notified, and arrived shortly afterwards, politely requesting that the Frenchman provide an explanation for his dishevelled appearance. Masson was unsure how the captain would receive his account, and was surprised when the German reacted with neither anger nor disbelief. In a calm tone, Haas explained that the gaping wound which the doctor was now cleaning on the priest's face was compelling evidence, as was the manner in which the bodies of his men had been previously discovered. He then paused for a moment, seeming to reflect on some distant memory, before regaining his composure and informing the priest this was not the first battle where he had been exposed to where his opponent appeared to defy rational explanation. Rising to his feet, the German officer ordered 2 soldiers to escort the priest to his office when he had been treated for his injuries, before he considered his next move. It took what felt like an eternity for Masson's injury to be stitched back together, before he was offered a hot meal and then taken to meet Haas. On entering the office, Father Masson found another soldier stood waiting for him, alongside the captain. He knew enough about military uniforms to recognise the man was a paratrooper, what the Germans would term a Fallschirmjäger. Haas introduced the NCO as Sergeant Linz, whose squad would be escorting the Frenchman back to the monster's lair. It was soon clear from the manner in which Linz carried himself, and the deference with which his men responded to his commands, that the sergeant had gained a great deal of combat experience during the relatively short course of the war. Masson watched on, as Linz and his command equipped themselves with a variety of both standard issue and bespoke weapons. There was little conversation as they made their way to a waiting transport, the German paratroopers saying only what needed to be said. As the lorry wound its way through the back roads, Linz had questioned the priest in relation to their opponent. He asked the creature's size, the speed with which it moved, whether it had actually taken flight during the encounter. Masson's replies were jotted down on a small notepad, which was then passed around, for the other men to read for themselves. Minutes later, Masson felt the vehicle slowing before it finally came to a halt. Wordlessly, the soldiers clambered down from its rear, before forming a close semicircle around their leader. Linz's briefing was short and to the point. Whilst the bulk of the unit would engage the monster head-on, a pair of paratroopers were to set up in the nearby heavy machine gun post. The 2 men detailed to deploy the squad's MG-42 nodded in silent assent. It was a task they had performed repeatedly during previous engagements, with flawless speed and precision. Several of the assembled soldiers knew they owed their lives to these men and this deadly weapon, one which had saved them from more than one hopeless encounter in the past. The briefing over, each man discarded any item of equipment deemed non-essential before they moved off into the undergrowth. Masson trailed behind them, quietly impressed by their coordinated movements. Weapons up and ready, the paratroopers continually scanned the area around them, proceeding at a steady and disciplined pace. The squad proceeded through the trees like ghosts, generating little sound as they penetrated the foliage. Behind them, the sky was lightening, signifying the approaching dawn. Masson was reflecting this had been the longest night of his life, before a brawny hand had suddenly grasped hold of his arm. The trees ahead were opening up into an area of open ground, adjacent to a dense wall of rock. They had arrived. The Frenchman pointed to a small patch of grass, much darker than the surrounding ground. This was where he had last glimpsed the attacker, feasting upon Engel's remains. There was no sign of the young lieutenant anymore, or the lamb that had been tethered to the metal ring. Other than the soft whistling of the wind and the sounds of distant birdsong, they were alone. With a silent motion of his hand, Linz indicated for his men to fan out and surround the cave entrance. Simultaneously, the pair detailed to deploy the heavy machine gun melted back into the cover of the tree line. Masson could feel his heart hammering in his chest as the first couple of paratroopers neared the gaping void set into the rock face. Their objective attained, the soldiers now came to a halt, training their weapons on the darkness that lay ahead. A minute passed, then another. Some of the men shifted their weight from one foot to the other. Another rolled his neck gently. There was no sign of the enemy. 2 more minutes elapsed, but the German troops remained motionless, their weapons remaining upright and steady. A primal shriek suddenly echoed forth from the bowels of the portal that lay before them. Before any of the Germans could fire, the beast came hurtling from within the cave, propelled at lightning speed by powerful wing beats. The paratrooper nearest the cave was seized by a pair of huge hands and torn in two, his machine pistol clattering noisily to the floor as he died. Instantaneously, his comrades opened fire, round after round tearing into the creature, which responded by hurling the remains of its victim at another German before launching itself forward. The paratroopers continued to fire, pacing steadily backwards as they did so, back towards the trees. With a roar of triumph, the monster sunk its teeth into the shoulder of another nearby victim, blood fountaining forth from the fatal wound. As another of his men fell, Linz bellowed at the survivors to concentrate their fire on the unfurled wings of the attacker, which immediately began to disintegrate under a hail of well-aimed gunfire. The creature howled in anger, taking hold of a helpless soldier and slashing open his throat with a talon claw. Almost immediately, Linz yelled the order for his men who were still standing to drop to the ground. However loud and piercing the creature's roar had been, it was trifling compared to the new sound that flooded into the clearing. Masson screamed aloud, clutching his hands to his ears in desperation as the heavy machine gun opened fire. Over time, those who were forced to face the MG-42 would nickname the weapon Hitler's buzzsaw, and the reasoning behind this gruesome epithet was about to become clear. A ragged line of gaping and cratered holes suddenly stitched their way diagonally up and across the creature's exposed torso. It barely seemed to have time to register the damage it was taking before it was spun backwards on its heels and thrown to the floor by the sheer force of this volley. With a pained shriek, wings flapping wildly in desperation, it rose, but the Fallschirmjäger had done their job well. The two appendages were by now too perforated to achieve flight, with the monster only able to roll itself back upright before it was cleaved in two by another murderous burst from the machine gunners. His ears ringing, the young priest managed to stagger back to his feet and caught sight of Linz dispatching two of his men off in the direction they had arrived in the clearing from. It would take several minutes for his hearing to fully return, during which time he watched on as the sergeant and his men had begun the grim task of gathering their fallen comrades. When the two paratroopers returned, Masson saw they were carrying fuel canisters from the lorry, and they began to soak the creature's remains with the contents of these containers. Linz approached him, offering a cigarette. Masson declined, continuing to stare mutely down at the beast's bloody and mutilated body, whilst the sergeant spoke beside him. Linz explained that he had standing orders that in the event he survived this encounter, the monster's remains should be frozen and transported back to Germany. Masson turned to look at him in horror, but found he was met with a weak smile. Although Haas had been obliged to pass on this edict when he had briefed the paratroopers, he had privately ensured that Linz understood he was to destroy any last trace of this creature. The sergeant lit his cigarette, and then used a match to ignite the fuel-soaked carcass, stepping back as wild flames issued forth from it. As they began the long walk back to their transport, he paused for a moment and asked if the Frenchman would be good enough to bury his men in the local church. The padre immediately agreed, eager to pay thanks to the warriors who had finally rid his people of an ancient evil, one that had dwelt amongst them for far too long. In the years that followed, Father Masson would receive no small amount of criticism from the people of Vigny, indignant that German soldiers should be buried alongside their friends and relatives. but not once did he ever speak of the reason for their presence, or the manner in which they had died, ensuring that the secret of the monster and the unholy bargain that his predecessors had made with it followed him to his grave.